Hi, so my name is Drew Rosen, and this is my submission for the English 2089 research presentation. So I brought in my friend Eammon Kelly. He was kind enough to read my paper and do a little bit of background research, and he is a strong believer that technology is actually a detriment to the English language. So we're just going to have a discussion about it. I'm going to try to convince him that that's not the case, but I'm just going to let him present his viewpoints, and we're going to have a discussion about it. So Eammon, I'll let you take the floor.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. I feel like a good place to approach the conversation is the thing everyone jumps to immediately is texting in current society between people on mobile phones and across the internet on message boards and stuff. Texting has really kind of taken language and boiled it down to a really primitive state, and all the structure and all the meaning behind it and all the vernacular that provides reason is kind of lost, and people kind of create their own language through it, and it really deconstructs what people would refer to as normal literature. Texting has kind of been bemoaned as the downfall of written word, and the BBC even quotes it as penmanship for illiterates.
Well, that's definitely that BBC makes it sound pretty negative by saying that, but we have to remember that spoken language has been around for almost 80,000 years, and writing in context of that was really only invented about 5,500 years ago. So like texting or like writing, texting is basically just an artifice of language, and to say that it's a penmanship for illiterates is kind of the equivalent of saying that the Rolling Stones is not music simply because it doesn't have a full orchestra. Essentially, you're comparing language based on your construct of it, but what we really need to realize is that language has constantly been evolving, and for what we see is that over time, as I was saying, it's constantly changing, and texting is sort of the next step in language. What we see is that it's allowing for people to communicate in a much faster way. And what we see is, like, when we talk to each other, we don't talk the same way that we would write a paper. Texting is sort of the next step of this, and it can be much more nuanced than just people sometimes believe it is when text like IOU or something like that. What it really is it's much more nuanced than that. It's allowing people to communicate at a much greater speed, and it's adapting to our lifestyle. We're always on phones, we're always on computers, so if we're communicating that way, we should be able to communicate with the same speed that we communicate verbally, and we shouldn't be limited by the constructs of how we speak necessarily to influence how we text, just as we aren't influenced when we talk by how we write. So that would sort of be how I would respond to that argument.
Okay. I like the approach by comparing it to music and how a symphony doesn't compare to a rock band, but I would argue that on a similar level, a rock band doesn't compare to some very experimental music that's all sounds. And something that people use on a daily basis that everyone can appreciate and everyone needs to understand really needs to be based on something that everyone is taught and everyone approaches from the same point of view. So when teens invent different words and combine words and create slang, it really creates an issue where language is no longer language, it's more expression, and it creates problems to communicate between people. And modern technology is allowing people to do that more and forgo the time taken to write something out and make sure it's written in a way that everybody can understand it, because people can be sloppy. People can spew things out fast because they have the chance to correct it when someone doesn't understand. The Daily Mail says that adults mimicking teen speak are to blame for spreading slappy English words, which is putting future of the language at risk. And I honestly believe that, because when you forget the foundations of a language, it kind of derails it and it shakes the pillars of it, and it makes it difficult for anyone to understand it.
I think that's a very valid point. I think that you argue it very well. But I think we need to remember kind of what I was arguing, at the beginning, that as I was saying earlier, that we had this issue, which is that language has been around for so long; it's constantly been evolving. And where you're kind of coming from is that just because texting is something new that it doesn't hold the same weight as written word. But you need to remember that you wouldn't hold our conversations to the same standard as how I would write a paper or anything like that. So the quote that you pulled from the Daily Mail is very interesting, but I don't think we can say that adults are necessarily proliferating teen speak and that that's causing children to be sloppy. Realistically, they're proliferating this speedy language because they realize that the same adults that are communicating by text are the ones that are language is adapting to like who we are, and I think that's really important. And I know that in my paper I mentioned this, and Berner is the one who says this quote, that basically since its invention, language has been evolving and adapting to the needs of its user. Now that we have the users on cell phones communicating through the internet, they're developing new means, and their language is still evolving. So basically what we need to realize is that these young people are interacting with other people their own age, and they're developing new words, new phrases, and new constructions that are different from the older generation, but that doesn't necessarily make that wrong. It just means that they're developing a new way, which is the most efficient to speak based off of our lifestyle. So I think that's kind of my response to you, is that you need to, you're claiming that texting is sometimes, we're going to forget our roots. But, over time, everything has constantly changed. We don't write the same way that Shakespeare did, 400 years ago or 200 years ago. The King James Bible, for example, the construction of all of those sentences is extremely different, and we've dropped that now. We have, the NIV Bible, which has a completely different phrasing than the King James Bible did. So I think we need to realize is that you're arguing that we need to basically stay stuck in the status quo. The reality is that that's not the case, that language is constantly changing and constantly evolving.
Okay, I can appreciate that, and I can understand how language evolves. But when things like words themselves change, which are the construct of our language, they're the building blocks of it, it makes it difficult for things to change in a matter that people can grow with and understand. And while the structure of language can change, I feel like the building blocks usually can't unless the language itself is completely different. Dr. Crystal has been quoted as saying text messaging and social media apps are often cited as a particular problem. Children of the future will no longer be able to spell because of them. And I feel like if you're not even able to put out the words that you're using to communicate correctly, then people won't be able to appreciate what you're saying, and language itself is kind of taking a step back.
Yeah, I think that some people view it as a step back, and others see it very differently. I think that Professor Crystal, for example, is a very big admirer of some of the online tongue, and this same professor actually was caught saying that they might not be reading Shakespeare and Dickens, but they're reading and cooking up these amazing little games and showing that they're very creative. And what she was referring to in that was essentially this new type of language. We see it in Russia, for example, where a lot of people in Russian are using this vernacular that's just it's dumbing down their actual language to writing it out phonetically. But by doing that, they're playing this interesting game, and they're using the internet to proliferate that language, where some people might see it as dumb. They're not able to spell, but realistically, that's not it. They're actually so clever that they're manipulating language in new ways to fit what they're trying to do, which is to try to be funny, to try to get an audience, to get a rise out of people. And so, while this is a microcosm of, Russian slang, devolving into this, phonetically written language, it also shows that technology is able to proliferate this type of information, and we have these. And I think ultimately the internet is actually provoking people to push language. You have sites like 4chan and Facebook and other social media sharing sites that are allowing people to get this audience and to manipulate language in new ways. And that's really important because it allows people to, to actually bear witness to this new type of language that is more about humor and wordplay. And it's kind of the same thing that Shakespeare was doing when he was making these like dirty jokes in his plays. A lot of people saw that as very lowly, but nowadays we look back on that, and that's extremely valuable to us because it was pushing language forward. So I know you're saying that how can we move on without the classic building blocks of language? But the reality is that as language changes, those building blocks change, and we change our perception to those based on the lives of the user. And again, going back to sort of my thesis, which is that language changes to adapt to the needs of its user, and it's no longer necessary to be highfalutin all of the time. So I don't know what you have to say to that.
Okay, I can appreciate that language changes and adapts with how the user uses it, but in certain situations, say after people rely on technology, after people get used to speaking through text and through shorthand in this new internet age, what happens when it starts bleeding back over into our spoken word? What happens when it starts affecting the way we speak and our structure and vocal language? Verheyen was quoted in 2013 saying that students are trying to rail to distinguish contexts in which text language is acceptable. And I think that doing that in a way that affects our vocal language is kind of changing more than just the building block and more than just the construction. It's changing how we use it entirely and changing how we understand it entirely. We're going from a text-based thing to a vocal-based thing. And while one is shorthand on a page and you can understand it, hearing text shorthand verbally can be difficult to understand and appreciate in the same way.
I think that that's a very interesting read on that issue. But I think one great example of how that actually serves to the opposite point is acronyms. For example, in texting, acronyms make a lot of sense. LOL, laughing out loud, or other things like that. But those bleed outside of just text messages. CCTV, for example, that was said that it was blasted as it was going to be a bland, clumsy, rhythmically and null and phonetically forgettable word. But CCTV stands for closed circuit television, and now we abbreviate that down to TV, and that's across all languages. So I think what we need to see is that while it's true that and I see what you're arguing, that it's hard to bring language into vocal language and then bring that back into spoken language.
Yeah.
I think what we ultimately need to realize is that it's not just within texting, that it's a little bit more broad than that. That text is sort of representative of this new type of language where people are being able to communicate at the speed of their lifestyle. And I think that's kind of a microcosm for how technology has allowed language to develop, because it's now able to proliferate new types of language. And while some people might not use text properly, they might there might be a small handful of people that are texting that are allowing that to bleed into their writing, and that who's really to say that that's not right? Our formalities of MLA writing currently make that seem wrong, but who's to say that MLA won't continue to change, because the standards for MLA formatting have changed over time. And I think ultimately we need to take a step back and realize that technology has allowed so many different types of language development to proliferate. I mean, outside of just texting, we have emailing, we have flash fiction, for example. Comparatively to classic poetry of the 1950s, it's kind of an insult to what writers were doing back then. But to a lot of people, that's really beautiful. And I think what it represents is this new type of language where being succinct, sometimes being quick, being able to communicate in a fast-paced lifestyle, which is that lifestyle now, is really important, and it's being reflected in how people are using language and also using technology to proliferate that to other people. And I think ultimately what we need to see is that language is allowing people, or technology is allowing language to develop at a much higher speed. As I mentioned in my paper, Kleinman has been quoted that the internet is an amazing medium for language. Language has always been evolving, but technology has had a strong effect at the speed at which this evolution occurs. And so I think that a lot of people are overwhelmed because they haven't seen language change so quickly until technology came along. But realistically, when we go back, the printing press was technology, and that changed the game for people to read, to understand, everything, written word. So I think historically, there's always been people who are adverse to technology, but in the grand scheme of things, it's allowed language to change and develop for the better. So that would be what I would want to conclude with. Anyways, I know we're running a little bit short on time, but Eammon, thank you so much for coming in and talking with me, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do round 2. Thanks.